Hi, friends. Welcome to our webinar, our Ask Me Anything session this afternoon. It's the middle of the summer. It's the 18th of July. It's an absolutely beautiful day. And I know that we have wide variation in weather all across the country. So there's lots of interesting challenges that people are having. This is the first Ask Me Anything webinar that is not publicly announced, or I should, when I say publicly, we haven't posted it on social media. This has been strictly internal AEA newsletter only, and we intend to continue doing that into the future. So there were a few questions that were submitted in advance, and I'm going to dive into those. My goodness, looks like we have quite a few questions that were sent in advance, actually. So I'm going to go through these. I expect a lot of questions today. I'm going to try to move fairly quickly. I know I love the explanations. They're important, but I'm going to try to keep things brief where I can. The first question that came through: what do you recommend for ideal potassium management for crops that fruit continuously, such as zucchini and peppers? The answer is high levels of manganese. Elevated levels of manganese allow the plant to serve in the plant as a potassium thermostat to a degree and allow the plants to self-regulate their potassium absorption and utilization. Second question, is there a nutritional cause for individual grapes ripening on a bunch much faster than others, with 30 plus days difference between ripening times of the individual berries? It makes harvest timing a big challenge. Ooh, this is a good one. Yes, there is. This is can be related sometimes to insect challenges, can also be related to temperature extremes during blossoming and pollination. And we have some previous experience with this. I'm trying to remember back. If I recall correctly, our solution was elevated levels of boron and manganese in particular. When we got calcium balanced out, we got those trace minerals balanced out, we no longer had the variation in berry size, even when we had temperature extremes during blossoming and pollination. Third question, do plants have the ability to regulate mineral nutrition they absorb through foliar sprays, or are they forced to absorb what is present? I don't know that I would use the term forced to absorb. It depends, of course, on the form of nutrient that is applied, because many of the nutrients are not particularly soluble. It depends on if you're applying soluble nutrients and so forth, but in general, the plants will desire to absorb. They are designed and configured to actively absorb nutrients through the leaves. And they are usually non-selective. So it is possible it's quite easy actually to create toxicities and to create excesses with foliar applications. So we do have to be cautious to not over apply. Yeah, I think I'm good. Just hearing my children and hearing some of the children in the room next door. Wanted to make sure the doors are locked. All right, next question. What may be a possible cause for leaves developing a twisted petiole and turning themselves upside down? I've seen this on several occasions. There's a couple of tomato cultivars that do this quite readily. See it most commonly on tomatoes, potatoes. Don't see it so much on tree fruit, although I've also seen it on nut trees. And it can be, there are some herbicides that can produce this effect, some very light doses of herbicide residue. So if you see it very uniformly across an entire block, that would be one of the things that I would consider. It can also be produced by a combination of very low levels of calcium and very low levels of zinc. And I would suspect there's probably other nutrient combinations that can cause it as well. But I would particularly look at calcium, zinc, and possibly herbicide residue. Question from Davis Stella. Why do native plant communities fend for themselves so well, but our commercial crops take so much effort from the farmer to be healthy and productive? The wild land around my farm is lush, vibrant, and healthy, while my crops look quite unhealthy in comparison. And oh boy. Well, broadly, it's because our agricultural systems and the way we've managed our soils, we haven't managed our soils for them to be healthy and to produce disease-resistant crops. So when you once you manage mineral attrition of the soil itself, mineral balance and microbial balance, your crop should be as healthy as the wild ecosystem. And there's also a genetic component. What are the genetics of the plants that you are producing? Are they optimal for your environment and ecosystem? But you should be able to produce domesticated plants in a cultivated scenario that are as healthy as the wild ecosystem that is around you. And then there's a follow-up question. Why is liming of the soil a necessity in many operations? Obviously, it adjusts pH and adds needed calcium, but how has our crop production evolved to need what seems like a significant soil modification across the board? The most common reason why liming is needed on a regular basis, for the record, liming is not needed on a regular basis on farms where the soil ecosystem is managed well. We work with many soils that have a history of intense liming applications, or where it's common in the area to put on regular limestone applications. And once you shift how you manage the soil's fertility, the need for regular limestone applications disappears. And there are several reasons why it disappears, but I'm going to leave that for another moment. For right now, I will say that the reason regular liming is a necessity on many operations is because many fertilizers are very potent acidifiers, as is liquid manure and a couple of other inputs as well. So if you are regularly adding liquid manure, if you're regularly adding acidic fertilizers, chemistry fertilizers, then they will create the need for regular limestone applications purely from a pH perspective. Once you start looking at remaining mineral balance, balancing biology, that need disappears. Question from Kevin Royer. Hi, Kevin. Can farms switch to regenerative or organic farming from conventional without getting premium pricing for their product? Short answer is yes. I've interviewed many farmers on the podcast, and we work with many farmers who do not receive premiums. And then the follow-up question is there enough yield boost or cost savings to make the investment and the change worthwhile? And the answer is a resounding yes, without question. There is a very tiny minority of the growers we work with who receive premiums. If I had to guess, I would say off the top of my head, it's less than 10% for sure. It's probably in the 5 to 7% range at best. The majority of the growers that we work with are getting rewarded for the transition and for the work that they're doing purely based on improved crop performance, improved quality, improved yields, etc. Question from Mads Gerner. I'm starting a small farm on 7 hectares in total, combining intensive market gardening with perennial fruiting crops. We have 50 plus different species and many different cultivars. Does it make sense to use sap in this context? Certainly not on all crops across the board, I would expect. We had one of our consultants worked with a group of growers. This is now probably close to a decade-old information, so we need to update this, but they were working with greenhouse tomatoes, small-scale greenhouse tomatoes, and working with that crop and observing the economic crop response that they were able to produce, they determined that it requires a commercial crop value of $5,000 or greater in order to justify the use of sap analysis based on the improved crop performance that can be resulting from it, from a purely economics, dollars and cents perspective. I would suspect the cost of shipping has increased since then. I would suspect the use of season-long sap analysis might be a bit more, and I don't know if that tracks with what the crop value has been. But I think generally you could say $7,000 to $10,000 crop value is somewhere in the ballpark of what is needed to justify the use of season-long sap analysis. Question from Henry Peters. What could be the possible causes for macadamia trees to have a higher than normal Brix reading? For example, 20 to 25 in the young and old leaf. Nutrient levels on a sap analysis seem well balanced, but the trees are not looking healthy at all. Loss of many old leaves, low harvest, and the farm has a very poor water quality. There's a long list of things that could be possible causes. I wrote a blog post on why we do not use Brix analysis as a management tool. If you just go over to my blog at johnkempf.com and do a search for Brix, or look at the tag index, look at the library and look for Brix readings, you'll find a couple of the blog posts that I wrote on Brix, and I've given the answer there in that blog post. And then it could be dehydration, could be dehydration because of poor irrigation water quality. There's quite a long list of possible factors that can lead to an artificially inflated Brix reading. Oh my goodness. 43 questions. That happened quick. I do enjoy all the questions, so thank you. I'm going to try to keep moving here. Question from Catalan: can we treat blueberry scorch virus through nutrition? The answer is yes. Virus and viral expression responds in particular to elevated levels of, or I should say generous levels of selenium and molybdenum, and perhaps some of the other very high atomic weight trace minerals. But the one reference that I've been able to find in the literature for viruses generally is selenium. We know that zinc also has a contributing role as well. So the short answer is yes, you can manage viruses with nutrition management, and it takes particularly abundant levels of the trace mineral metals to accomplish that. Are there any cover crops that can be planted? Question from Dennis: are there any cover crops that can be planted in front of CC to help with rootworm control? I'm not sure exactly what CC is, but rootworm makes me think that it's perhaps corn. Cover crops for rootworm control. I can't think of any off the top of my head, although I would suspect there probably are some. I just don't know what they are. And I will also say that you can balance the minerals and the nutrition inside the seed with seed flare, and make sure that the seed and the young seedling has generous levels of magnesium, sulfur, molybdenum, and boron, and perhaps also use a couple of immune elicitors and get effective control of rootworm using a nutritional approach in the season, even if you don't have a cover crop ahead of it. Question from Carolyn. Skimming this quickly. My plants are getting munched on, I think, by snails. So after listening to your recent Ask Me Anything, I applied some foliar iron and now have pretty happy plants. My question is about tomato and geraniums that are getting either leaves or flowers eaten by worms. Do you have any suggestions to what inputs these plants might be missing or what they might have too much of? It's a good question, Carolyn. I would suggest that you look at our webinar on the plant health pyramid. I give some very specific recommendations for managing magnesium, sulfur, and molybdenum and boron, and I think that will solve your problem. Question from Peter: if applying a foliar feed of magnesium, sulfur, molybdenum, and boron to boost plant immune system, what form of these elements would be best? And what is the ideal part per million for the spray mix to be? The context is recently Albrecht mineral balanced soil biology inoculated with Johnson Sioux compost extract, trying to prevent allium leaf miners and flea beetles and young brassica transplants in the early spring. So, Peter, the easy answer for your question is look at our product. We have a product at Advancing Eco Agriculture that is called Photomag, and we put Photomag together specifically as the solution for this problem. Question from Anthony. Hi, Anthony. If a tree has a fungal or bacterial issue, can raising foliar nutritional copper above normal levels with foliar spray reduce the need for copper fungicides? What are the negative consequences of raising leaf copper levels above normal levels? A couple of good questions, Anthony. In general, yes, you can use copper as a nutrient and get copper nutrition inside the leaf, and it will have similar bactericidal, fungicidal effects as copper that is applied on the leaf surface. However, obviously, much lower application rates are required in order to produce this beneficial effect inside the plant. And what are the negative consequences? It depends on how high you go. You can easily go 3 to 4 times higher than the common recommended levels with no particular downsides that I'm aware of, at least. You have to go really high. You have to go to levels above 30 parts per million before I'm aware of there being any particular detrimental downsides. And those elevated levels above 30 parts per million, I don't know this for certain about plants and plant microbiomes. I'm speculating at this point. I know that in soils, when you go above 30 parts per million, you begin really compromising the microbiome that's in the soil profile. And I suspect there's probably a similar threshold in plants. It would seem logical that that would be the case, but I don't know that for certain. So that's the one piece that I would keep in mind. Question from Paul, can we talk about fungal to bacterial ratios? I speak about fungal to bacterial ratios in some depth in one of my webinars on YouTube where I talk about how to build soil organic matter quickly. And the short version is, with my current level of understanding, I might have a very different answer to this question in a year or two from now once we have the DNA lab operational and are able to generate lots of data on the soil microbiome. But as of this moment, I'm much more concerned, or think it's important to pay much more attention to absolute levels of fungal and bacterial populations rather than just purely the ratio. And the reason I say that is because the total levels of both fungi and bacteria in most soils are so abysmally low that it's completely pointless to talk about a ratio. If we think about it on a scale of 0 to 100, and we want the levels of both bacteria and fungi to be at 100, and on a 1-to-1 ratio, it's pointless to be squabbling about having a less than ideal ratio when fungi is at 5 and bacteria are at 1, or vice versa, where fungi is at 1 and bacteria are 5. And there's some who say, oh, well, you have a bacterially dominated soil and that's the cause of all your problems. No, that's not the cause of all the problems. The cause of many problems is that we don't have nearly enough fungi or bacteria in that ecosystem. And before we can engage in a conversation about ratios, we first need to have a conversation about total levels. And the other point is that the bacterial and fungal biomass ratios, I mean, the microbiome is determined by plants. If you want to change the microbiome, change the plant species that's growing. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but there's a great deal of foundational truth there. Question from Luke, how do Brix levels affect Lepidoptera larvae in almonds? The same as they do any other larvae in other plants. I would refer you to Tom Dykstra's webinar on our YouTube channel where he goes into some detail. The short answer is when you get Brix levels in leaves, again, as long as it's not affected by drought or by I'm not a fan of looking at Brix levels for the very simple reason that it's too variable. And you could very easily get a Brix reading that is above a certain threshold, and that I might say, let's say it's 8 Brix, and still have larvae, for the very simple reason that you have nutritional or mineral imbalances. So I would prefer to look at sap analysis mineral ratios and use those to predict disease or insect susceptibility rather than Brix readings. Question for Davis. I grow trees in a field nursery setting. Trees are grown in rows 10 or 12 feet apart, similar to an orchard or vineyard, using AEA products. The amount of foliar applied products in a tank mix is calculated on a per acre basis. So products in the spray tank would be 18% of a per acre rate. Davis, you're asking a question about a topic that I've been intending to write a blog post about or do a webinar on, and it's just not climbed up the priority list yet. There is particular language and there's correct terminology to use to describe this concept of sprayer concentration mixing, and it's escaping me right now. But Stephen Bierling talks about it in the podcast interview that I did with him. It's worth checking that conversation out, or at least I think it's in. I've certainly had this conversation with Stephen on several occasions. But Stephen's approach to foliar applications is based on tank concentration rather than on a per acre rate. And his point is that if I'm putting on a per acre rate on full grown trees, in the case of his orchard setting, he's putting on 200 gallons per acre. If he's, I shouldn't say fully grown trees, fully leafed out trees in the summer, he's putting on 200 gallons per acre. In the springtime, at bud break, he's putting on 25 gallons per acre to get the same degree of coverage. So if he goes by the per acre rates, he's getting a mix that is 8 times more concentrated in the springtime as he is later in the summer. And so instead of looking at things from a per acre perspective, he's calculating them on a concentration perspective. And the concentration would be similar to his 200 acre or 200 gallons per acre concentration. So he's applying less product per acre, but the tank mix concentration is the same, and he's producing similar plant responses. Question from Darren. I'm interested in your thoughts on any relevance of biblical agricultural insights that you have seen make a difference. For example, resting the land on the 7th year. I've come across 2 individuals who've done that. Darren, you ask really good questions that would merit an hour's conversation in and of their on their own. But the short answer is that I also have observed a couple of farms, actually more than a couple, a number of farms who take a sabbatical year, but they don't just ignore the land and walk away from it. They're actively growing cover crops on it. They're actively seeking to regenerate it. The one farm received such spectacular results from this process, they actually moved to doing it 1 year out of 5 instead of 1 year out of 7, because they found that the increased performance and productivity that they were able to achieve more than made up for that 1 year supposedly not being in production. And the short answer is that those growers who actively seek to align with foundational spiritual principles, those farms and those plants just simply seem to perform exceptionally well consistently. Question from Renaud is Wollastonite as oxidative as limestone in the microbiome? It's not my understanding that is the case, because in the case of limestone, the oxidative component is coming from the carbonate, which is not present in Wollastonite. Question from Phil. Small-scale CSA and home gardens often suffer from pest pressure and poor nutritional quality because they are too small to use tests like plant sap, and they have a wide variety of crops. What are the low-hanging fruits or must-dos for these kinds of growers to improve their crop quality? Phil, I put together an entire webinar to answer this question. I did a presentation for the Bionutrient Food Association. It is on their YouTube channel. I think it's like 90 minutes long. And I describe what are the foundational broad picture pieces that you need to accomplish and that you need to work on and focus on to eliminate the need for customized management. So I would refer you to that resource. Is there any particular reason why I'm not even mentioning the Common Ground movie? I don't know. I wasn't asked, and I'm more popular in some circles than in others, perhaps, maybe. I don't know. It didn't even occur to me. I'm also not, I don't show up, my face doesn't show up anywhere on video, on recordings publicly, or at least I try to avoid that happening. So I'm not particularly a video or movie friendly subject, I suppose you might say. That's probably as much of the reason as anything. Question from Aaron. Do you have any experience with AE products in controlling swede, midge, and brassicas, especially broccoli and cauliflower? The answer is yes, we do. And again, comes back to managing the nutritional balance around nitrate and protein conversion, using photomag to facilitate that process and so forth. Please connect with some of our AEA team members. We can help with that. Question from Mr. Anonymous, who prefers to not be identified. What nutrient profile can you guess for spider mites, mealybugs, beetles, downy mildew, and thrips on chilies? Rainy season, warm and humid, that has nothing to do with it, by the way. Saturated soil, that might have something to do with it. Plastic mulches heating to the sun. Sat pH 5.8, refractometer sugar 16. Both of those numbers are largely meaningless without knowing a lot of other additional information. The good news is I don't have to guess for spider mites. Guessing is for people who don't have data, and we have collections of a great deal of data. For spider mites, I'm completely certain that you have elevated levels of ammonium. The plants are in photorespiration mode. They're breaking down proteins, using proteins as an energy source because they don't have enough sugars. And same for mealybugs, beetles, downy mildew, thrips, all of these pieces. I can't go through, I'm not going to take the time to go through and give you a detailed breakdown, but you don't have good protein metabolism and protein conversion. And with the case of downy mildew, there's there's a combination of phosphorus and manganese and silicon that you do not have enough of some of those three elements. Thrips are an interesting one, but they're also related to protein metabolism, having adequate levels of molybdenum and boron. Question from Andrew. What treatment plan would you recommend for tar spot in organic corn? Can you briefly explain what the pathway is for the Accelerate product to increase soybean yields and when it is too late to apply that particular product? So for a tar spot treatment plan, you have to pay attention to the trace mineral metals. You have to pay attention to boron. You have to pay attention to calcium, silicon. The AEA products of Micropack and Micropack would be a really great fit here. And that would probably be what I would recommend. Accelerate is particularly designed to increase the initiation of reproductive buds. It can increase the number of pods per node and increase the number of beans per pod relatively easily. So once you are at the stage where you are getting close to the end of the blooming and pollination period, then Accelerate is no longer going to continue to have a significant impact on increasing the number of beans per acre. However, at that point, even if you can successfully set many more beans per acre, you still have to fill them. That's going to require additional potassium. And Accelerate doesn't contain potassium, but it contains lots of potassium synergists that really enhance the plant's ability to absorb and utilize potassium and becomes more potassium efficient. So there is still a crop response from later applications, but not as significant as it is from earlier applications. My goodness, lots of people are looking for instant diagnosis on their disease and insect problems without a SAP analysis. Here's Elmar asking, without analysis, what is the most common issue and its remedy when carrot flies have a field day with carrots? It's improper protein metabolism. These plants are not metabolizing nitrogen properly. They are not forming complete proteins. Look at the levels, look at the minerals that are on level 2 of the plant health pyramid. This is what you need. The 4 minerals that are described in level 2 of the plant health pyramid to solve the problem. Question on how to lower Brix in macadamia trees when you have to produce a healthier tree and to get it to produce more fruit. Get rid of the refractometer as a management tool, start using SAP analysis as a management tool, and adjust minerals accordingly. And if necessary, also fix water quality. What creates poor calcium availability? Question from Renaud. That could be really poor soil biology can create that. low levels in the soil can create that. You need a target of 70% base saturation on the Albrecht test, like a Melic 3 or an ammonium acetate extraction, or on sandy soils, a minimum of 1,000 parts per million. Sometimes you have very sandy soils and they'll show you have 70% base saturation, but it's only at 500 to 600 parts per million, and that is not enough. You need at least 1,000 parts per million. You need good biology, and you need adequate boron supply. Those three pieces will contribute to calcium availability. And also, I'm speaking of this and thinking of this in terms of my historical training on mineral balancing, which is very relevant. But we also have lots of tests where when you address biology, you know, going back 15 years ago, maybe not quite, yeah, it's probably as close to 15 years ago, we were doing some of the early stage testing for the product that is now known as Rejuvenate. That's a part of our soil primer application. And we ran a series of tests on 10 farms where we just did field scale trials, pulling a soil sample on before it was treated, then leaving an untreated area, applying a second soil sample pulling a second soil sample after the treatment the following spring. This was fall and spring, and then again the following fall soil sample collection. And on these 10 farms, they were widely scattered geographically, mostly across the Midwest and the Northeastern United States. And 4 of the 10 farms showed significant increases in calcium on the soil analysis. When I'm talking significant increases, one of them jumped from 50 to 70% base saturation. It jumped by 600 parts per million. And there was no calcium applied. It was just a function of biological release as a result of putting on it was before the soil primer. That was just with a Rejuvenate application. Question from Eugene. We have more than 2 weeks of higher than 100 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. Vegetables have stopped growing. I'm irrigating every day and applying foliar applications every week. In the foliar applications, I add 0.1% calcium chloride for a high point of deliquescence. Should I add more? No, you should not. If you want to increase the point of deliquescence in a high heat environment, I would recommend avoiding chloride, because chloride is simply going to increase the water requirement. So I would recommend using materials like calcium nitrate or something like that, even though nitrate brings its own set of problems. In particular, in that high heat environment, I think I may have spoken about this in a couple of recent podcasts, but pay particular attention to sugars and perhaps adding some sugars to the foliar mix. Question from Matthew. Want to know your opinion on using plant growth regulators to increase yield, specifically experimenting with triacontanol, freeze-dried coconut water as a source of zeatin, and a number of other compounds, gibberellins, and have had mixed results at best and some strange morphological effects. Any input or ideas would be appreciated. Interesting question, Matthew. Not one that I can answer in just a few minutes, but the short version is that these applications they're very concentration dependent. As you're discovering, triacontanol and some of these other compounds are effective at part per billion concentrations. It does not take much. And when you over-apply them, then yes, you get plants behaving in very unexpected and strange ways. And also, the particular stage of plant growth, when you apply them, can have a tremendous bearing on their effectiveness. And the third point is that usually it is better to apply these materials in what's the right way to say this, in their natural substrate rather than as purified compounds. So for example, applying willow bark extract instead of salicylic acid, the willow bark extract has a lot of the other associated compounds that buffer out and allow the plant to regulate the salicylic acid much more effectively. So those are some of the things that I would keep in mind. How come fruit turns yellow and aborts before ripening? Having troubles with cucumbers and squash. This could be a result of poor pollination, could be a result of not having enough nutrition. And if it is not enough nutrition, it's probably trace minerals like boron and manganese. What role does silicon play? Question from Luke. What role does silicon play in the plant's immune system? And is it better to apply silicon as a foliar application or as soil applied? The best source of all is to develop really good soil biology and to have the plants absorb silicon from the soil. But in the growing season, once you have something, you have issues that you want to address, foliar applications tend to respond faster. The plant responds faster within a matter of a day or two or three, whereas with soil applications, with the fertigation system or so forth, it might take a week to 10 days. Question from Fernando. Is there a problem or challenge to the microbiome applying boron and molybdenum with a compost spreader in a solid amendment, given a lack of application equipment? The key piece is that you need to get good distribution. So particularly with higher boron application rates, I would say that if you use a pelletized boron, if you have good application equipment and you're looking at higher application rates, it's not that difficult to get good boron distribution. But molybdenum is a different matter because of the very tiny amounts that are required. And so my preference would be to spray molybdenum onto the soil. But if that is not an option and we have the necessity of applying it with a compost or with a granular fertilizer spreader, then I would suggest still solubilizing the molybdenum, turning it into a liquid, and then spraying it onto the compost as it's being loaded or as it's being mixed, or in some way getting that liquid material thoroughly blended through the dry product that is being applied. Because if you're applying ounces per acre of product, then you're not going to get good distribution of that if you put a dry material into a compost mix. Is effectiveness of foliar nutritional sprays increased at night during the dark photosynthesis cycle? The most effective timing of foliar sprays is in the evening, and it's my understanding that is primarily because it remains liquid on the leaf surface longer because of a lower dew point and having more abundant moisture levels at night and more effective humidity at night than during the day. Question from Luke, is molybdenum more effective as a foliar application or soil applied for nitrate reductase? It needs to get into the plant. So you can do that foliar application very quickly, get an immediate response, or you can apply it to the soil, and it does work very well in the soil as well. Question from Vance, what have been your observations in the effectiveness of foliar nutrient application through center pivot? Lowest application rates are 7/10 7/100 to 17/100 of an inch. Provided I can apply above the canopy as an alfalfa, is this an effective way to apply nutrition? Yeah, Vance, this is a good question. And I have conflicting experiences, so I don't have a good answer. We have a number of growers who've applied products through the pivots on corn in the Midwest, particularly in the southwestern part of the Corn Belt, where it's quite dry, and they get very good responses from that. Then we've had people try something similar on potatoes, and they're using sap analysis, putting on manganese applications and so forth through the pivot, and just not, even with small amounts of water, just not getting good crop responses, not getting good plant absorption of manganese. They put on a similar or even a smaller application rate with a sprayer, and they get an immediate crop response. So in the case of the corn crops that are responding nicely, I guess the question is, how much better would they respond if it were sprayed on versus applied through the pivot? So I have some conflicting observations there on what we've observed so far is that the foliar sprays seem to perform better than the pivot applications generally. Would you expect, question from Matt, would you expect that as soil health improves with the use of mineral and microbial products, that the need for these products would diminish? In a well-managed ecosystem, yes. The goal and the objective should be to develop regenerative soil and crop management systems that are self-perpetuating and self-regenerating to the point where we do not need to constantly add additional external inputs. However, what those ecosystems look like and what those management systems look like on different farms is what's the right way for me to communicate this? If you are growing, there are some ecosystems which I am persuaded are going to be dependent on inputs for the long term. If you're growing strawberries in the same soil year after year after year, then it doesn't matter to what degree of microbially friendly products you use. You are in a production system that I think is going to require the dependency on the use of continued inputs. That's obviously an extreme on all the way on one end of the spectrum, but if we're growing crops like potatoes, where we're introducing heavy tillage, or carrots, the list goes on and on, when we're producing crops that are damaging soil aggregate structure, soil microbial communities, we need to find some ways to offset that damage. And that could be with other management practices, that could be with other things that we're doing, or it could be with products. Those are pieces that we have to figure out in each farming context. Question from Rafe on EDTA, chelated iron and manganese. You're much better off using amino acid or organic acid chelates like the AEA rebound product than the EDTAs. EDTAs do work, but that depends on how you define work. They will make this, they will increase sap analysis levels, or they can increase sap analysis levels of iron and manganese, but not nearly to the same degree as a healthier chelate does. Question from Matt. I'm doing sap and foliar applications of Rebound and Micro 5000, etc., and have been getting fantastic results on our peaches that have been organically grown for a few seasons. We bought a commercial conventional apple orchard this spring and tried to go cold turkey. Oh dear, that can be fun. There's different versions of, or different definitions of fun. Despite you having previously highlighted the need to earn the right to drop fungicide, etc., the block we went cold turkey on is hit hard by scab and a few other issues. My question is, what signals can we use to understand when we have earned that right to drop fungicides? Specific nutrient levels on sap? Yes, that's the answer. You got it. You guessed it right in one go. Level X on plant health, etc. So yes, Matt, the answer is looking at specific nutrient levels on sap, combined with, you'll just observe season to season progression of overall tree health, and it can happen really quickly. It can happen in a single season. So we have, it was so great. I had a conversation yesterday or the day before with John Ela, who just came to work for AEA, who described what really got his attention half a dozen years ago. Where AEA really got his attention was observing a neighboring orchard that was able to get complete, I forget now, was it fire blight or scab? I think it was complete scab resistance using our approach. And it's a lot of fun to hear those stories and when those things happen. So thank you for the work you're doing. I'm excited to hear that you're getting such fantastic results in your peaches. Question from Cole. Some of my corn is very short, but the leaves are wide and the stalk is larger in diameter than in my other fields. A lot of it is only 5 to 6 feet tall and getting ready to tassel. I know that a short stocky plant is desirable, but where is the line of that being true? Is it possible for 5-foot tall corn to yield 300 bushel per acre? The answer is yes, it's possible. It depends on the genetics. And there's a lot of genetic variability that comes into play here. It's my understanding that, in fact, some of the highest yielding corn varieties are short varieties. There is not necessarily a relationship between vegetative biomass and yield. Of course, all that depends on how many nodes, is it a flex year, plant population? There's lots of variabilities that play into this, as you know, but it's not necessarily true that shorter plants are going to produce smaller yields. Question from Jorge. What do the aster weed plants, the daisy family, especially these chicories, indicate? Should I insist on cutting them near the base or pulling them out with its full roots? If possible, actually, depending on your cropping system and context, you should let them go. And if you want to know why, you should listen to the recent podcast episode that I had with Rick Clark. Question from Gary Redding. Hi, Gary. When mixing calcium, silicon, and boron in a solution, the farmer has seen some precipitation producing a sludge. Can you say if this is a combination that is just not possible, or if it is, what suggestions do you have to get them into solution? Gary, the first place that I would look is at the silicon. Silicon is a very temperamental ion, very temperamental product to deal with. And depending on the form that was used, if it was potassium silicate or something like that, it just simply doesn't mix well with other stuff that is in the tank. So that would be my first guess about what might have been going on. Question from Luke. If a synthetic nitrogen fertilizer application is absolutely necessary, what form would you choose and why? I would choose urea, and I would blend it with our nitrogen efficiency protocol that you can find in our webinars on YouTube. Question from Brian Harris. What is the best way to fix sick soil fast? My goodness, try saying that 3 times quickly. Fix sick soil fast. I have a webinar on YouTube that is titled How to Build Organic Matter Quickly. And that's where I would point you to for an answer to that question. Question from Joe. I'm attempting no-till in a market garden setting. I've been growing a few rows of alfalfa and using the cuttings as mulch for the vegetable beds. I've recently learned that a lot of the nitrogen contained in the alfalfa may be oxidizing and lost to the atmosphere as ammonium instead of being decomposed. Is there a way to limit nitrogen volatilization when using a chop and drop method, or am I wasting my time fixing N just to have it return to the atmosphere? Lastly, could increasing the carbon nitrogen ratio of the residue reduce nitrogen loss? For instance, if I were to grow a rye alfalfa cover blend and harvest it for mulch. Joe, it's a very good question. I discussed this question a bit in my podcast interview with Helen Athow, and she also writes about this very well in her book. And I would propose that we are overemphasizing the need and the benefits of nitrogen in these situations, or many situations, but including in your market garden setting. The reality is that if you build soil carbon, you will have such a tremendous storage sink for nitrogen that you don't need to continue adding nitrogen on a constant basis. So forget about the need for alfalfa and to grow a high nitrogen cover crop. Simply build your soil carbon. So instead, focus on high carbon cover crops. Get as much carbon into the system as you possibly can. And all of a sudden, your crop responses to additional nitrogen are going to disappear. That's the way that I would think about that. Question from Herb. Hi, Herb. In the midst of fruit fill on citrus, conventional wisdom is that potassium is critical. The growth is leggy with longer internodes than desired, but potassium may exaggerate this. I use silicon and calcium. Will these overcome the potassium impact, and should they be foliar or soil applied? In the case of the scenario you're describing, I would suggest foliar applying them because you're already in the growing season and you need a rapid response. And I would also make sure that the plants have generous levels of manganese because that will buffer out the hormonal response and will reduce the node extension. I'm trying to think of what else. The other piece to add is boron. Make sure you have generous levels of boron. Citrus require ridiculously high levels of calcium and boron compared to many other crops, as I'm sure you know. Follow-up question from Jorge. Since the Asteraceae daisy plant family plants are showing up on their own as weeds, does that mean I should invest in that same botanical family for cover crops? The answer is yes. And again, for those of you who are hearing this conversation, this framing for the first time, please listen to the podcast episode with Rick Clark, where we discuss Christine Jones' work. When time is it getting to be? It's already an hour in, and I now have 80 questions instead of 40. When taking on, I will stick around to answer all the questions, unless it goes 3 hours, but I don't expect it to. So I thank you for all of your patience, and I will stay here and work my way through all the questions. Question from Edward. When taking on new degenerated land, what is the best way to regenerate soil biology? A summer cover crop mix with inoculated seed and foliar feed for any deficiency, or farmyard manure liquid digestate before autumn drilling? Definitely the summer cover crop mix with inoculated seed and foliar feeding is going to regenerate soil biology. And the reality is that this shouldn't be an either or question. It should be both. I mean, there's no reason you can't do both. Do a summer cover crop and then do the farmyard manure in the fall, or liquid digestate before autumn drilling. That's the ideal. Question from Vance. What are the implications of high chlorides in plant sap, as in higher than total nitrogen? And what might I do to lower chlorides in corn? Vance, the first part of the question is easy. The second part, not so much. So whenever you have higher chloride levels than total nitrogen, our expectation is that you will have very high insect susceptibility. Whether that means aphids, spider mites technically are not an insect, but we'll still put them into that category for the sake of discussion. On this topic, corn earworm, European corn borer, etc. When chloride levels are higher than total nitrogen, the susceptibility to insects just goes through the roof. I would suggest upwards of 85%, maybe even upwards of 90% of the time, when you have high chloride levels, you will be able to find insects in the field most of the time. To the second part of the question, what might you do to lower chloride levels in corn or in any other crop? And there's a few answers to that question. Building calcium levels is a part of it, and building silicon levels is a big part of it. So making sure the plants have generous levels of silicon will help with chloride buffering. And the longer term answer is that as you improve soil biology, even in very saline soils that have high chloride levels, you will begin observing chloride levels dropping down over time, over a couple of years. Question from David. Do I have experience or knowledge of using industrial hemp as a cover crop in crop rotations? I've got some limited observation, and I'm quite pleased. It looks like hemp is very effective as a bioremediation material in building carbon quickly, but I haven't seen it being widely used at this point. A question from Darren. Is foliar feeding molasses a possible way to increase sap sugar content? The answer is yes. It does that have effect, but it's temporary. The plants will metabolize and utilize those sugars that are applied. Depending on how much phosphorus they have, they will metabolize all of it anywhere from within a day to 3 to 4 days, depending on the quantity that you apply and how much phosphorus they have. So there is a temporary sugar spike response from applying sugar, but just a temporary response. Question from Griffin. What remote soil moisture sensors would you recommend? I don't have a qualified opinion. If you would have asked me this question 10 years ago, I knew all of the soil moisture sensors that were in the marketplace at the time, but I've not stayed closely connected to that space, and there's been a lot of innovations and new technology, so I don't have a qualified opinion. Question from Dave. My total digestion soil analysis showed no detectable amounts of molybdenum, selenium, or nickel. How are native ecosystems managing to thrive in this context? Dave, this is a very good question. And I've learned some things in the last month that I'm mildly annoyed by. I believe, I shouldn't say I believe, I suspect that a part of the answer is that these plants are extracting some of these minerals that are not showing up on the total digestion analysis. But I don't know that for certain, and that may not be true on some soils which may not have those levels, may not have some of those elements present at all. However, what I've learned in the last 6 weeks is that a total digestion analysis is not total. And that's been moderately annoying. Because the story, my personal history and story with these nutrient analysis is that roughly 15 years or so ago, we started using soil analysis that were geological mining assays. They were used by miners to assess what is the mineral profile of soil or of rock for mining purposes. There are 2 labs in Canada that run these analysis. One of them is called Acme Labs. Another one is AGIT or AGIT Laboratories, AGAT. And I recommended that farmers begin using these tests, and both of those laboratories were very difficult to work with. They have a broad array of different types of samples that you can ask for, and they were less than supportive and less than enthusiastic about running one-off samples for farmers instead of running hundreds of samples for mining companies at one shot. But one thing about those samples is that they would measure every single thing that was in your soil profile. When they ran a total analysis, it was total. And you added up all the numbers and you came up with 100%. But what is being called a total digestion soil analysis, I have yet to have this conversation with any of the laboratories. So I have not yet dug into the exact methodology, but I have had, in the last month, I've had half a dozen farmers tell me that when they pulled a total digestion analysis today versus 4 or 5 or 10 years ago, their nutrient levels have significantly increased. Their nutrient levels of manganese and phosphorus and so forth, which tells me, and when I say significant increases, I'm talking jumps in manganese from 20 to 120. If there were mild jumps, 5%, 10%, then it would be worth contemplating and thinking about, well, are these minerals being brought up by plant roots higher in the soil horizon? Is that some of what is happening? But the level of increases, nutrient availability increases that are being observed, I don't think can be accounted for simply by plants moving nutrients upward. So I'm coming to the conclusion that as what is being called a total digestion analysis is not total, which would make sense given the pounds per acre and part per million values that are being reported contrasted with what I saw years ago from the 2 geological mining assay laboratories. So I got off down in a little bit of a rabbit hole in that answer to your question, Dave, but I think those are the pieces that we need to do more homework on and need to figure out. Because for these elements, plants can adapt, some plants more than others, to the absence of some of these minerals, but it's my understanding that most plants to have a completely functioning enzyme system require these elements in even a tiny amount. Nickel is required in grams per acre. It's in the part per billion threshold. So it's a very tiny amount, but can plants be truly healthy and disease and insect resistance in the absence of those minerals? I have my reservations about whether that can be consistently true. If I were to plant apple trees in eastern central Pennsylvania into new ground, how would you do it and what AEA products would you use? I would recommend that you call our team or send them an email and ask them that question, because it's too much of a question for me to get into right now. Question from Greg Pennyroyal. Hi, Greg. My goodness, you've been waiting for a while to get your question answered. Your podcast with Rick Jones reflecting on your visit with Christine Jones was amazing, just like Christine. In the podcast, you mentioned the use of Artemisia for the control of powdery mildew. I'm intrigued. The limited scientific literature suggests that this is a mutual quorum sensing ISR that's induced systemic resistance. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, ISR functionality. Do you have any leads or contacts for further research? Yeah, if people were to call me and ask me who I would suggest they dig into this further, I would suggest this individual who is an awesome vineyard producer named Greg Pennyroyal, who would probably have the connections. It's a great question, Greg. It would be interesting to speak perhaps with Michael Gruzak at the USDA or a couple of others. Let's connect directly and I'll see who else I can come up with. I'm sure there are people out there that we can do some research with this. And if anyone listening is interested in doing research on how plants in the landscape affect disease resistance of other plants in the landscape, please reach out and let's coordinate, because this is a fascinating topic that I'm very interested in, and I'm sure many other people are as well. Question from Darren. Are there any silver bullet approaches for reversing bacterial canker in stone fruit? Yes, there is one easy approach that has not yet failed once, and that is implementing a full AEA program using sap analysis, correcting it, problem solved, done. Question from Jorge. We don't have sap analysis available in Brazil. What do you think we could do to improve our plant health in an ordered technical way without guessing? I'm still doing the tissue and soil analysis, but they always come back with good results, while I still have issues with broad mites and rust on my organic blackberries. Any thoughts on those? So I did speak about mites for a little bit as well, rust also. The good news, Jorge, I don't have an immediate answer for you on solving the technical difficulties, but if we're able to continue on our current trajectory with our research with the crop ticks sensors, we expect to have a marketable device by the 2026 growing season. That will be an in-field sensor that will give you a nutrient readout in real time. So that will correspond to sap analysis. So that's to be announced in the future. Question, what could I do to address a field overtaken by thistles? I know this may be a calcium or compaction issue. Plan is to treat the field and then plant cover crops. Are there any specific nutrition or any specific recommendations for nutrition in cover crops? Yes, I would particularly recommend that you use gypsum, calcium sulfate. And again, I'm making this recommendation blind without knowing what's going on in the soil, but I would recommend gypsum. I would recommend that you consider the use of sorghum Sudan grass as a cover crop, because it's known to be effective at choking out thistles. Is poor biological activity why I get a good response applying silicon if silicon is abundant globally? The short answer is yes. Your soil biology isn't delivering enough silicon if you get a strong response from a silicon application. Question from Brian. You consistently get asked about best practices or what the best thing to do is in this or that situation. From a farmer who's taking on over 100% conventional minded and stubborn operation, broadacre crops, what are the top 3 things I should look at not doing or are most detrimental when attempting to navigate over to a more regenerative minded operation? Brian, I love you. I want to have a follow-up conversation. That's the best question I've ever been asked. Now, it's interesting the way you phrase the question from a farmer who's taking over a 100% conventional minded and stubborn operation. I think what you're saying is that you are not 100% conventional minded or stubborn, but the previous decision makers have been. And it's my hope that those decision makers are previous and you have the autonomy to make your own decisions. What are the top 3 things you should look at not doing that are most detrimental when attempting to navigate over to a more regenerative minded operation? Oh boy. I'm going to give you, instead of 3, I'm going to give you the one thing that I think is most important. And it's the one thing, and it is not a practice. It's not something you should do or should not do out in the field, but it's something that you should do for yourself. And there is this prevailing trend that I see remarkably clearly amongst the best farmers and those who produce the best outcomes consistently. And that is, do not rely on your advisors to give you all the information or Do not rely on your advisors and agronomists and consultants and just follow their recommendations. You know, as a farmer, as a grower, it is necessary for every one of us to have a team. It's necessary for us to delegate knowledge. We have tax advisors, we have accountants and bookkeepers, we have veterinarians, we have animal nutritionists, we have agronomists, we have all of these people that are as part of our support network. We can't possibly have deep expertise in all of those areas. But the one thing that I've noticed is the farmers who are most successful insist on having and developing their own deep expertise on the specific factors that determine their crop's performance. I've interviewed Mike Omeg, and I've talked about him a bit in the past in this regard. But Mike Omeg with Orchard View, one of the things that when we first started working with Mike, the landscape has changed now, it's very different. But when we first started working with Mike a decade ago, at the time, the marketplace that they were targeting demanded cherries that were large and firm in size. That were large and that were firm. Those two quality components, size and firmness, directly connected to their bottom line. And as a result, Mike refused to delegate the knowledge of how to produce large cherries and firm cherries to his consultants. It's like, I want to understand this myself. I really want to understand it deeply. And that pattern prevails and holds true over and over again. So the one thing that you can do, or the one thing that would be the most detrimental for you not doing, is to not become informed yourself about what are the factors that actually make you money, and understanding those agronomic factors deeply. Question from Lidze. How would you recommend trying to reintroduce endophytic bacteria, as encouraged by Dr. James White, found in wild plants, back into traditional vegetable crops not native to the US, like broccoli or cucumbers? And would wild strawberries potentially be used to inoculate our cultivated ones? Lindsay, perfect question and perfect solution. Yes, we should try to use plants that are in the same plant family and grow them as cover crops or as companion plants for the crops that we want to reintroduce microorganisms to. So if we want to produce a brassica crop, let's see if we can grow some wild brassicas, some undomesticated brassicas as a cover crop ahead of that crop, or perhaps as companion plants. There's a lot of discovery and a lot of information, or a lot of research that remains to be done in this space. But in short, we should seek related undomesticated plants and see how we can get them to share their microbiomes. Question from Ethan. What is the importance of somatics? Do you have any work done with electroculture practices incorporating sound? Ethan, I've done some interesting work in this space, but it's beyond the scope of this conversation for me to really talk about it. But the short answer, I'm persuaded that electroculture holds a lot of promise and a lot of potential, but its present incarnation is quite, the way much of the work that I see is quite unscientific, and we're not taking environmental variation of electromagnetic environments into consideration adequately. Question from Griffin. Can apple scab be managed nutritionally in a high moisture environment? Yes. Running into the issue of not having enough leaves to sample for sap through the growing season in ambrosia and cosmic crisp. Assuming you're, the reason for that is because you don't have enough new shoot growth, which you may want to avoid as well. You may need to have more trees or a larger pool to pull from. I think that would solve that problem. Question from Elmer. In your podcast, you sometimes interview guests and have conversations that are in the realm of fringe science. Is there a specific reason or experience why you never touch on biodynamics, even though a lot of the things you express are quite in line with modern biodynamics? Yes, Elmer, this is a good question, and there is a reason. It's not that I'm opposed to biodynamics in concept, but there is one thing that I have an absolute allergic reaction to, and that is dogma. Whenever we have individuals or groups who take very dogmatic positions that this thing must be a certain way or must not be a certain way. One of my mentors had this phrase. He used to say, there is no rule in agriculture that has not been successfully broken by someone somewhere. And early on in the early days, I was friends with, and I'm still friends with, some people who are doing some very innovative work in biodynamics that was very different from the mainstream and from the history. They had continued on doing their own research, and they were very ostracized and polarized within the biodynamic community. And I don't particularly have a dog in that fight, but I was very, the biodynamic community largely appears to me, from as an outside observer looking in, appears to me to be stuck. They're stuck in dogma. And I'm speaking very freely and very candidly here because you asked the question. But I think for biodynamics to be more widely, readily accepted and to begin making progress again and not be stuck in 60, 70 years ago or longer, they need to lose the dogma. That's my frank opinion. Question from Opar. Foliar applications help crops to increase yields in hotter temperatures, especially tomatoes and peppers in clay soils. What foliar trace elements would you advise me to apply to enhance flowering in tomatoes and peppers? Well, in high temperature environments, you particularly need manganese and you particularly need boron, but you need to address all of them together. Zinc, copper, etc. also need to be addressed. Question from Olivier Hussan. Oh my goodness, Olivier, it's an honor for you to be here and for you to ask me a question in a public session like this. Would love to have a follow-up conversation with you. I'm struggling to understand the relationship between electrical conductivity and Brix in plant leaves. Theoretically, electrical conductivity is related to ions, mainly charged particles, and as sugars are not charged, Brix and electrical conductivity should not be related. However, in the fruit juice industry, there are many publications showing clear relationships between electrical conductivity and Brix and temperature. How do you explain this? Furthermore, can we really be affirmative on the fact that high Brix are needed for healthy plants? Clearly, very low Brix are not satisfactory, but wouldn't it be possible that very high Brix reflects a very efficient photosynthesis, but a poor transformation of the produced sugar, especially poor proteosynthesis, and thus medium Brix would be preferable? Good questions, Olivier. As I understand it, a Brix reading is not truly a measurement of sugars, a direct measurement of sugars. Instead, it is a measurement of total dissolved solids. And as such, it measures, while sugars are a significant component, it measures more than just sugars. And in the SAP analysis, let's see if I can say this correctly. I sometimes get it backwards. SAP analysis measures the total non-reducing sugars. And so it is actually, on a SAP analysis, it is detrimental for the sugar reading to get too high. We want medium range because when the sugar levels become too high, that is a reflection of the plant not properly metabolizing those sugars and forming more complex carbohydrate structures. So as a result, there's no correlation between a sugar reading on a SAP analysis and a Brix reading. You can have a high Brix reading that is a result of more complex carbohydrates and yet still have a mid-range sugar reading, which is what you actually want to see. So I don't know. I think that points at some of one of the questions that you're asking. And then the other question that you're asking is, in some cases, our team is looking at some interesting correlations with electrical conductivity and mineral profiles and sugar readings. But I suspect in some cases, a high Brix reading is the plant deliberately keeping sugars high as a buffer to high electrical conductivity elements that are high enough that they're actually problematic. Chlorides, for example. When we have plants that have really high chloride levels, it seems we also have really high sugar levels. And that is actually problematic. But I think there's more to the story here. It's probably beyond the scope of me. I still have lots of open questions here, but I'd love to have a follow-up conversation and dig into this with you, and perhaps loop in Greg Pennyroyal and a couple of other people into that discussion as well. Question from Erwin. You once mentioned a French farmers community around the topic of cover crops. What was their name? This is the second or third time I've been asked this question recently, and I need to connect with a group of farmers and find out because I don't actually know off the top of my head. So Erwin, please follow up by email and ask me that question again so that I don't forget, and I'll try to get the answer for you and share it with the larger group as well. Question from Francisco. Working on a unique undomesticated tomato cultivar. Problem I'm having and trying to solve is it has lots of flowers, about 100 or so, but no fruit set. Soil test indicates it has high levels of NPK. Calcium looks good. Francisco, if I had that situation, I would put on a foliar application. If you have access to the AEA products, put on a foliar application of Accelerate, and I promise you it will fix that problem. It'll turn a tomato plant not only yellow with blossoms, but they will pollinate and hold on very well. I would suspect the answer is either low manganese or low boron, or a combination of both. It could also be zinc, perhaps as well, but it's probably a trace mineral problem. Most manganese, zinc, boron are the first three places that I would look. Can you purchase AEA products in Europe? And if so, where? If not, when can we expect this? Soon. We're in the process of going through the regulatory approval, or in the early stages of that, just beginning that process right now. So how long does that bureaucratic process take? I don't have experience with European registration. I don't know. Could be 6 months, could be 18 months, could be longer than that. But we are intent on being in the European marketplace sometime soon. And if you have any interest there, please reach out to our team and get connected with them, express interest so that we can begin pooling and connecting people who are interested in figuring out how we make that work most effectively. How can we manage bacterial wilt? Causal organism is Pseudomonas solanaceum, which has no solutions. Sure, it has a solution. The solution is just simply good nutrition management, again, with trace minerals. And I can't give you a specific formula off the top of my head, but I'm confident that mineral nutrition is going to solve it. Follow-up question from Cole. My pumpkins were planted 11 days ago. They exploded out of the ground, and the cotyledons on some plants expanded to a full 5 inches by 3 inches. That is awesome. Is this normal? I've never seen it in previous years and found it exciting. I used BioCoat Gold and watered it with a mixture of Johnson Sioux extract and AEA nutritionals. I love this, Cole. Thank you for sharing. This is why I keep saying that most people don't know what healthy plants actually look like anymore. And the answer is, it's perhaps not normal as we define normal in our common experience, but this is what really healthy plants are capable of. And yeah, 5 inches by 3 inches is remarkable. Please share some photos. I'd love to see some photos of that. Question from Tiago. I have snails on my vegetables, but I did a soil test and I got a lot of iron in my soil. Why are my plants not absorbing iron? There's a webinar on YouTube on this specific topic where I talked about increasing trace mineral metal supply. I forget exactly what it's titled, but something to do with trace mineral metals. And the short answer is it's because your iron that is in your soil is not in a form that the plants can utilize. I describe why that is the case. Question from Brian. I have a farm in Western PA that's been out of production for 15 years, has goldenrod and mixed grasses on it. I'd like to bring it back into production. Would you mold board it? I thought about planting Sudax, then drill cereal rye for weed suppression. I also thought about buckwheat next year as a cash crop. Pull a soil analysis on it, see what the mineral profile looks like. Frequently when we have goldenrod being dominant, it's also a reflection of having acidic pHs and not having enough calcium. So you may want to incorporate some limestone at some point. And you're asking me a question without enough information to make a qualified recommendation, but I'm not opposed to moldboarding it. And the only thing I would suggest is that rather than planting a cover crop of a single species, get hold of someone who is really good at putting together cover crop combinations. Let me see, you're in Western Pennsylvania, possibly Keystone Bioag, possibly green cover seed, and plant a combination species, a combination cover crop that has 6 or 8 species at least from different plant families. And that is going to recover soil faster than a single species by itself. Question from Nico. Hi, Nico. Potato beetle issue in potato beds. Nico, the answer to your question with potato beetles is a foliar application of rejuvenated photomag. Question from Rich. Listen to your podcast on the plant health pyramid and critical points of influence, but I find myself needing more information. You referenced the book Marshner's Mineral Nutrition of Higher Plants, but it's well out of my budget, looking for other resources. Rich, I'm sympathetic. I know nothing about your life situation and what's going on in your life, but if you are growing crops commercially, and maybe even if you're just growing them at home on a home scale, then the book Mineral Nutrition and Plant Disease cannot be out of your budget. If you can afford to plant fruit trees, you can't afford not to have that book. It's just the level of information. Yeah, we need to, the best investment we can make is investment in knowledge and information and investing in ourselves. I'm particularly confused about proper timing of nitrogen application. You've often stated that nitrogen applications are best applied when the plant needs it. I've mistakenly assumed this to mean that the vegetative phase starts after the plant gets its first true leaves and ends when flowering begins. In your recent talk at Groundswell, you said you wouldn't recommend adding nitrogen to any crop until 45 days after planting. Please elaborate. My goodness, did I actually say that about nitrogen? I did say that about potassium. It's a common recommendation for us for potassium, but I think you may have misunderstood what I was suggesting on nitrogen. We will often, as when we're in a transition phase, we will often do very light doses of nitrogen right at planting. Just when I say light doses, I'm talking 5 to 10 pounds per acre of actual N, and then wait to apply additional nitrogen until a side dress application later. And usually peak nitrogen demands for most crops are during the fruit fill, grain fill period. Same is true of potassium. Question from Lawrence. What are your thoughts on broadacre soil balancing like Albrecht? It seems too expensive for large scale operations, so just focus on the worst imbalances or feed everything through foliar in furrow. Lawrence, it's a very good question. So first of all, I'm very much in agreement with the Albrecht model of soil balancing and that the foundational principles are accurate. But I think what we've lost sight of, or what some practitioners have lost sight of, is there's been the assumption that the only way to balance minerals in a soil is to add whatever is low. But in fact, that's not the only way. The other way is to release what is present but isn't showing up on the test. And we've seen this a lot with our uses of rejuvenate and soil primer applications, where all of a sudden calcium levels come up significantly, potassium and phosphorus levels come up significantly, even though none has been applied. So very good biological products can have that effect. And cover crops, specific crop species and species mixes can have this effect as well. So it would be too expensive to try to balance everything perfectly with products out of a jug. But let's simply try to, let's release what is present in the soil profile. And in order to do that, we need to do two things. One is we need to understand, what is present in the soil profile in the first place. A total nutrient digestion test can help us with that, although I expressed my some of the things that I've been discovering about those tests a bit earlier. And then also, think about releasing those minerals by including cover crops and specific crop species into the mix. And while you're on the pathway, so this is a more longer term, sustainable, reasonable, practical approach to mineral balancing. while you're on the pathway to achieving that soil balance, you can spoon feed your crops with foliar applications or with in-furrow applications to ensure that they have optimal health. And they will actually help regenerate soil mineral balance more rapidly as well, simply by supporting plant health. And this is a much more economically viable and profitable pathway to producing the balanced soil profiles that we're looking for. Skipping through some of these questions that I've already answered a previous version of. Question on cutworm invasion in corn, refer to level 2 of the plant health pyramid. Question from Wes on photorespiration. Heard you talk about using Rejuvenate to help plants recover from photorespiration. I assume it is used as a foliar. How often can this be used? And what have you observed as to how long might a plant stay in photosynthesis before going back to photorespiration in continued high heat? Very good question, Wes. It varies a great deal depending on the plant that we're talking about, the soil that it's in, the irrigation water quality that it's being exposed to, and the temperatures. So there's too many variabilities for me to give you any answer, a good answer. But in general, we see a marked plant health response and plant health improvement response. It seems that, so first of all, because of the high heat conditions, photorespiration continues immediately, even after the Rejuvenate application. So if you put on Rejuvenate the next one evening, the plant absorbs it, utilizes it, begins metabolizing and converting ammonium back into proteins again. Even the next day when you have high heat conditions, I would expect that plant to be back in photorespiration mode. But it gives the plants a shot of energy that can sustain them and carry them. We see continued effects from a single foliar application as much as a week to 2 weeks later. And then, of course, as you know, during that week to 2 week time period, you have, in many cases, you've really changed the way that plant is expressing itself. If it's in a vegetative state and it continues to grow, where the effects from that one application continue to carry through the rest of the entire season. So there's this long trickle-down effect when it's applied, when it's actually needed. In the tropics, all of our squash get damaged by a bug that lays eggs in the immature fruit. Can this be managed with mineral applications? Yes, it can. You have to address a foundation of minerals, but then in particular, pay particular attention to boron. Question from Ned. I'm a dairy farmer in Ireland. First year transition to organic. We had a particularly wet spring leading to damaged soil surface with resulting tighter soil. After a cool, dry summer, there is poor grass growth. If I measure soil hardness and compaction, could that indicate present and future biological activity and thus, in my context, grass growth? The short answer is yes. You need soils that can have very good gas exchange in order to have good microbial activity and good aggregates crumb structure. So without a question, compaction hardness is going to directly lead to your volume of reproductive growth. So I'm speaking blindly here. I don't know exactly what your soil mineral context is. You could look at gypsum applications as a temporary measure to help recover some of that soil compaction. That would probably be one of the pieces that I would look at. And then you might want to look at perhaps interseeding or seeding in. Well, maybe a better way of saying it is just simply managing grazing a little bit differently to help recover from that. And I fully understand that if you were in an organic situation with a need to graze from a certification maintenance perspective, then some soil destruction is just simply unavoidable in these extremely wet conditions. But I had a conversation with Alan Williams on the podcast a couple of months ago that I think you might find particularly useful and interesting in this regard. Question from Ethan. What microbial inoculants do you find to be most helpful in rivers, streams, or lakes to revert toxic algae bloom or stop its cause from occurring? The answer is prevent phosphorus and nitrogen from getting into the water stream in the first place by having really good biology and reducing fertilizer applications. And you do that, you don't need to deal with toxic algae. Next, can foliar sprays be used to increase further rainfall in the future with increased acreage being covered by the foliar? Can foliar sprays be used to increase further rainfall in the future? Well, ecosystem management, when you manage entire ecosystem, the question is what scale? It depends on the microclimate, the local microclimate that you're in. But I'm persuaded that we can change local microclimates with as little as 300 to 500 acres. We can change weather patterns in local regions. And again, it depends on the scale and the scope of the microclimate that we're a part of. But a relatively small zone of plants that are respiring well and putting aerosols and bacteria and water into the vaporizing water into the atmosphere can change the small water cycle. Follow-up question is, do you find cities that have lots of pools and cement to continue to become hot bubbles of lacking aerosols that allow microbes to go into the biological cloud systems naturally, or allow them to form if the constant evaporation pools? I don't know the answer to that question, Ethan. It's be a good question for oh my goodness, my brain is getting tired. I just did a recent podcast episode with the individual on water cycles. Look at my podcast. I recommend him on Substack, and my brain is really starting to not work here. Cohen and Sion also has interviewed him on his podcast as well. Question from Marcus: is the manganese shown in the NOVA lab manganese chloride? No, it's not. It is in manganese in the reduced form, not in the oxidized form, as I understand it. And that's my understanding only based on, I don't think we're getting that from, there's no clear lab protocol that indicates that that is the case, but just looking on observational, anecdotal, or experiential data, comparing tissue analysis versus sap analysis, it's obvious that they're measuring two very different things. Question from Cole: my phosphorus levels in all of my sap tests, now over 20 tests, is all excessive, sometimes off the charts. None has been applied in some places for 2 years, so I attribute it mostly to compost extract use. Why does the biology provide nutrients in excess, and is this something that I should be worried about at all? It's as much as 1,300 parts per million on corn and 650 parts per million on soybeans. Cole, I would expect, first of all, plants can absorb nutrients in excess when it is very excessive in an environment, even when they have really good biology, although biology certainly helps to mitigate that. But when you have really high phosphorus in soil, that will actually prevent mycorrhizal fungi colonization. And so that is something to pay attention to. I would ask the question, do you have enough zinc levels? Because zinc can help buffer some of that out. And you might also want to apply more carbon and get more carbon into your system to bind with some of that phosphorus and to create a substrate where mycorrhizal fungi can thrive a bit more easily. And when you do that, I would expect to see phosphorus levels drop. Question from Elmer: what is the low-hanging fruit to change in politics to move agriculture in the right direction? Elmer, we need to have that as a separate conversation because there are several of them. And I asked this question on several social media channels a couple of weeks ago about how people would like to see the policy direction of the USDA changed. And I would refer you to that discussion on those social media channels for some very interesting answers. Question from Edward: in the UK, we have wheat crops not ripening because of low sunlight. What trace elements would help? Boron specifically. Foliar applications of boron will facilitate sugar transport and sugar flow out of the leaves into the grain and will speed up ripening. I wrote a blog post on that if you want to refer to it. Question from Lawrence: is it possible to reduce nutrients like manganese, iron, and zinc just by adjusting the pH, or is better achieved by fermenting it with lactic acid bacteria? So first of all, there's no direct correlation between pH and reduced nutrients. As I understand it, also zinc is present only in most systems, only in the reduced form. So it's only manganese and iron that need to be reduced. And the key is not just having it reduced in the nutrient solution, but also having it chelated so that it stays reduced once it's applied until it's absorbed. So that as that droplet dries out on the leaf surface, it doesn't revert back into the oxidized state. That's probably as or more important than making sure that it is fermented or something else. And by the way, our rebound line of trace minerals is in the reduced form and chelated, and it didn't get that way through fermentation. There's a question here on managing water challenges in almonds from Juan. Juan, I would suggest this is too detailed for me to get into right now, but reach out to our team at AEA and we'd love to help you out with the water balancing. Has AEA done any work with athletic fields or turf? Yes, we have. We have a lot of fun working with turf and would love to work with you. Please reach out to us. We'll make that happen. Question from Ed. Had a request for a weed management podcast suggestion for a market gardener. Do you have one to suggest as an introduction? I would suggest the interview that I had with Helen Athow as a starting point. Question from Brett, who has access to a byproduct of humic substance manufacturing called human. You have access to and that might be worth pursuing. Brett, I've never used human as a standalone, so I don't know the answer to that question. I would suggest experimenting with it before you do it on a significant scale. More questions here that I've already answered. Just flipping my way through here. Question from Jake Neistat. No-till conversion in vineyard systems. I'm in Northern California coastal region. It is common to see a notable vigor drop in the first few years that is commonly blamed on water competition and or nitrogen tie-up. Growers often revert back to annual spring tillage after this shock. Why do you suspect we see this drag moving from green manure plowdown systems to no-till systems, and what are some strategies to more easily transition? That's a good question, Jake. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I'd love to dig into this with you a bit more deeply. I suspect that it might be related to a loss of soil aggregate structure. When you have aggregation that is lost from tillage, it can take several years to rebuild. And also if you pick the right cover crop plants, you can overcome a lot of this very quickly in the first year. So I would love to dig into this conversation deeper with you because I actually think we can resolve some of this pretty quickly. Question from Lawrence. Can we achieve optimal nutrition of fruit trees in a syntropic agroforestry system just by pruning service plants like agroforestry trees, shrubs, and herbs in a very diverse and dense system and mulching all the organic material resulting from the pruning? Only if the soil actually has the minerals in it that are required. If you have soil that has a geological substrate that doesn't have enough iodine in it or doesn't have enough zinc in it, then it doesn't matter how much biomass you add back into the system, you have to address some of those mineral imbalances that are fundamental to that geological profile. Question from Jaco. Do you have advice on rehabilitation of old fields to reestablish natural plant species such as the grass and grasslands? Yes, it's all grazing management. Listen to Alan Williams, the podcast interview that I did with Alan. Rehabilitation of old fields, if you want, if they are in grasslands, you want to keep them in grasslands, you can renovate them and turn them into remarkably different ecosystems simply by how you manage the livestock on the surface, how you use them as a tool for rehabilitation. Question from Dave. Corn steep liquor powder has become far more expensive lately. Are there any AEA products that you would recommend generally to enhance the use of CSL or replace the use of CSL? In short, Dave, as we work with microbial inoculants, and we have released a new product this spring called MacroPack that really enhances both plants and microbes response. We're at the point where I don't know exactly how many of our growers use corn steep liquor, but many of the growers that we work with don't have a particular need for nitrogen as nitrogen. So I would suggest using MacroPack, and I would suggest using our microbial inoculants and biostimulants like the soil primer. And I would expect your crop response from corn steep liquor and from soybean hydrolysate is going to disappear or going to be reduced. Follow-up question from Olivier. Do you have any experience in the use of molecular hydrogen H2 for plant health when starting from very degraded conditions? Have you considered the role of H2 producing bacteria, including the N-fixing bacteria in plant health? Olivier, you ask fascinating questions. What we've observed is that when we grow plants that facilitate nitrogen fixation, whether those be legumes or whether they be plants that really enhance the populations of Azotobacter and Azospirillum and others, we get, depends on the context, of course, but we often get significant increases in soil availability of manganese and of the oxidized trace mineral metals. So I do not have experience or have not thought about the use of H2, molecular hydrogen, and I would be interested in having that conversation. Be very different from those growers who attempted to use hydrogen peroxide with very unexpected results. Question from John Pierce. Hi, John. Do you have any thoughts on plants uptaking silicon to buffer aluminum toxicity and the favorite ways to deal with high aluminum in sap? It is interesting that in our plant sap analysis database, there is this direct parallel, this direct correlation between silicon and iron and aluminum levels. And one way we could look at that data, I mean, the correlation between the levels of those three minerals is very, very high. It's the Pearson correlations between those three elements, I think, are all greater than 0.8, if I recall correctly, across many different crops. So that means one way of looking at that would be to say that when plants are absorbing more aluminum because of whatever's going on in their soil and the root environment, then they are also absorbing higher levels of silicon and higher levels of iron. And that could be a foundational aspect of their response mechanism or coping mechanism. Regarding foliar sprays in the evening, is the common wisdom misleading that the open stoma absorb the nutrients? Yes, it absolutely. It's more than just misleading, it's flat out false. Plants do not absorb the majority of foliar applications through the stomata. They absorb it across the cuticles, across the membranes. There's a whole bunch of science and information available on this, but the stomata, I forget exactly what the number is, but the stomata represents something like 0.5% of the total leaf surface area at the bottom, or maybe even less than that, some tiny amount. And nutrient absorption through the leaves does not occur through the stomata as a primary mechanism. It can occur in that way, but that's a very slight minority pathway. Question from Joe. I'm running a fertigation system using municipal water treated with chlorine and chloramines. Can I use my system to fertigate biologicals? Or would the chloride kill, or the chlorine kill microbes on contact? Well, it's in there for a reason. Would adding carbon source like humic acid or molasses help? We find that humicarb helps significantly more than humic substances, or excuse me, than humic acid. There's something, the fun part about humicarb being undenatured is that these humic substances have a particularly high affinity for halogens. So the entire group, chlorine, fluorine, bromine, etc., are complexed very quickly with humic substances, which is one of the things they're really good at. That would be my recommendation rather than ascorbic acid or the other materials that you asked about. Question from Henry, what SAP analysis training would you recommend to improve my understanding? We have a course on kind harvest that is called Precision Ag Plant Nutrition Management, where we go into some detail on the nutrient interactions. Question from Dave. Are you aware of any examples of cropping systems that use diverse perennial cover crops as part of fertility management in an annual crop setting? Yes, I just completed a podcast interview that is not live yet, but will be live in the next couple of weeks with Colin Size from Australia. He deserves to be much more widely known. He has developed a system that he's called pasture cropping. And there are people scattered throughout Australia and some here in North America who are in the process of experimenting and further developing and adapting his system to their local climate and to their local context. But check out Colin Size and pasture cropping. It's very worthwhile. Question from Nikos, do you have experience on potassium humate spraying on ground for orchards? Is it effective on high pH and limestone soils? The question that I would ask is, why do you need to apply potassium humate? Trees do a very good job of absorbing potassium, and I guess it might depend on your local soil context, but I would really question whether the need for a potassium application is actually based on plant benefit or based on the need to sell potassium fertilizer. Question from Jolyn Gingrich. Hi, Jolyn. What are some good resources for preparing for and establishing an apple and peach orchard in Central Ohio? Are there orchards in the Midwest that would be good to visit and learn from? Jolyn, please follow up with our team. We can connect you to a number of people that we're working with in Michigan and also some through Pennsylvania. I have some very particular ideas around tree fruit management. There's a couple of good books that have come out just recently, in the last couple of years. One of them is titled Concepts for Understanding Fruit Trees. Actually, the author is Ted DeYoung. I also interviewed him for the podcast. His show will be out in the next couple of weeks. And there's another book by Ann Ralph that is titled Grow a Small Fruit Tree. And there's another good book whose title is escaping me right now. But follow up with our team. I think you have my contact information as well, and I'll try to get some recommendations for you, because there are some really good books that have just been released in the last couple of years on orchard management in the context of a biological centric system rather than a chemistry centric system that are very valuable. Question from Robert. David Johnson says that about 200 species of bacteria and fungi are needed for productive plant growth and health. Do you agree? How many species are required? Are most of these naturally occurring, or do you need to add more species? Do they need to be inoculated? Robert, the short answer is in the next 6 months, well, by September, we will be announcing the release of a soil DNA lab where we'll be able to measure the complete microbiome much more accurately than we've ever been able to before up to this point. And in my opinion, I think there are tens of thousands of species. There are many more species than 200 that I think are required, that are beneficial. And there is so much that we don't know. The quantity of what we don't know far exceeds what we do know. But we're about to find out a lot more. Question from Wes Nelson. When doing foliars in Central Valley, it's difficult to keep the leaves wet for very long. 90 to 100-degree breezes in the late evening dries leaves very quickly. Early morning doesn't leave much time before the sun is up and drying things. Are there any recommendations raising the point of deliquescence? Yes, I would suggest doing that using C crop, using calcium nitrate, magnesium chloride, potassium nitrate, using materials that have a high point of deliquescence. Urea could also work. Is a couple hours enough on the leaf to be effective? The answer is yes, it is. And this is having high quality materials that can be quickly absorbed, and having good quality foliar water becomes even more important in this context. Can it be re-wet the following day to absorb what is left on the leaf? Yes, you could do that with irrigation, and that would probably be beneficial, but in a relatively minor way. If you look at the absorption curves, trying to remember where I came across this information. I think it was I have a book on my recommended reading list. I recommend a book from the International Plant Food Institute or something like that. That is kind of a roundup of the current science of foliar feeding. And if I recall correctly, when you have a well-designed foliar spray, the curve is very front-loaded. You can get something like 70 to 80% of absorption of nutrients in the first 3 to 4 hours from a well-designed foliar. Of course, it varies on the specific product and exactly what it is we're talking about and measuring. The other strategy you might want to consider is using larger droplet sizes. Rather than putting on such a small mist, use some larger droplet sizes so that they remain on the leaf surface for a longer period. Question from Marco: what's the next step to work together and bring AEA to Europe? Please reach out to our team at AEA, specifically Kish Johnson. Let's figure out how to make that work. Does AEA have any plans to expand into Africa? The short answer is yes. The next question is when, and that is when we get enough phone calls from people who want us to come there. Where can you find Brix soil nutrition balance information? From Acres USA. I also did a webinar that's on YouTube that's titled Soil Testing 2.0. That is a reflection of some of the things that we've learned about soil mineral balancing relative to sap mineral balancing. And in the course of that presentation, I didn't go into enough detail on the use of cover crops and the use of biologicals to address soil mineral balance, because that wasn't really the scope of the conversation. Is it possible to stop mosaic virus in pumpkins and butternuts? Yes. If so, what do I do? And once my plants have it, how can I get rid of it? I haven't observed on annual crop. I've observed on perennial crops like tree fruit and nut trees and so forth, also on grapevines, that you can reverse viruses. You can reverse viral expression from one season to the next. But in an annual crop, I don't recall that I have observed you can actually get rid of it, but you can stop it from continuing to progress and from expressing itself. And it is a reflection, amongst other nutrients, particularly of addressing selenium. Question from Tim Whiteman. Hi, Tim. A long time since we've spoken. Do you see well-managed small acre market vegetable producers being able to create enough income to be standalone income, and how small? The answer is yes. I did a recent podcast interview with JM Fortier where we spoke about this topic exactly. The smallest one that I know of is 10,000 square feet and 150,000 of net profit at the end of the year, growing microgreens. So as small as you would like. Can I talk about leaf cutting ants in general? Leaf cutting ants, yeah, interesting topic here. One that I don't have a lot of personal experience with, but from what little I have seen about ants in general, is that they really need plants that don't have enough levels of high enough levels of boron. Question from Dennis: what is the best way to control Canadian thistle in organic crop production other than alfalfa? I've heard that sorghum sudan grass is also very good. Addressing your soil structure, I have experience on a lot of farms where we have done different things and Canadian thistle disappeared. And it's hard to put together a common thread across all the different farms and soils, because they did many different things. There's even the story of this one farmer who had, I think I may have posted a blog post on this topic, fact, I'm pretty sure I did. It's a couple of years old at this point, but if you search on my blog for Canadian thistles, there's a farmer who renovated a pasture, planted it into organic corn, and the Canadian thistles that were in the row with the corn that the cultivator missed completely died when they were about 2 feet tall. It looked like they got some type of a disease and just died out, even though they were not yet being shaded out by the corn. So in short, I think Canadian thistles respond or thrive in soils that do not have good aggregate structure, that are compacted, particularly that if they have a compaction layer between 8 and 12 inches deep. And also, many of these soils tend to have certain layers that do not have good calcium supply. And that's kind of my best answer for the moment. We've done, some farmers put on a soil primer application and Canadian thistle just disappeared. But then you try the same thing on a different farm, you don't get the same response. We've had hay farmers that put on foliar applications of Rejuvenate and Holocal, and Canadian thistle disappeared. You try the same thing on a different farm, you don't get the same response. So there definitely is a farm to farm and field to field nuance that we haven't fully figured out yet. But when we do use our soil primer, Rejuvenate, calcium, and manganese applications, those are the 4 materials where there's this prevailing theme of Canadian thistle pressure being greatly reduced. It's 5 p.m. already for me. Remarkable how quick the last 2 hours went. Question from Anonymous. I have Gibberella, Diplodia, Fusarium, ear molds in corn in recent years. Is this a soil microbiology or fungal problem? Yes, it is. It's also a mineral nutrition problem as well. What are some steps or practices to mitigate these infections? In the short term, if you're already in the middle of the growing season and you already have infections showing up, the one solution we found to be quite effective is foliar applications of trace minerals, particularly manganese, zinc, copper, boron. And in the longer term, changing the soil microbiome and discontinuing the use of toxic fertilizers will go quite the distance. You could also start using humicarb and Rejuvenate in the furrow at planting, if that's a possible application, and that tends to solve lots of problems as well. Question from David Ryan. What are some high carbon cover crops? It's not a question of plant species. It is a question of diversity and maturity, simply letting them grow to more maturity and usually avoiding legumes. Question from Robert. Could you please speak to using wood vinegar to enhance EM byproducts? And would this stimulate new growth from old nodes on trees affected by winter kill? Or would I be better off with a kelp and hydrolysate? Any thoughts on wood vinegar products made from different feedstock and the targeted responses that one might expect? Robert, I'm very intrigued by this question. It's something that we're in the process of researching and gaining experience with, but the short answer is I don't have a good question or don't have a good answer for you right now. There is so much variability in various wood vinegars and so many unknowns. I think it will be quite a while before I would be comfortable making recommendations that we can have confidence have repeatable, consistent results in many different contexts and settings. Question from Julia Eden, trying to find a podcast episode with silvopasture running hogs and walnuts. I don't recall specific hog and walnut conversation. You might be thinking of the conversation I had with Austin Unruh. That would be one. And trying to think if others, I mean, I know a number of people doing interesting things. Zach Smith, the stock cropper, is doing some interesting things with hogs, as is Joel Salatin, as is Greg Gunthorpe, as is, I guess Rahe isn't doing hogs, but those are a few people in their work that I would look in that direction. Question from Sonia. Are there any cover crop seeds that can be fed to cows to help regenerate or reseed a pasture through their manure? Yes, there are. I know people that have done this, but I don't have experience with it, and I don't have I don't have any good anecdotes or stories that I don't have a qualified opinion on this. You can also just broadcast seeds immediately ahead of grazing. But the other piece to consider is that you can do a great deal of regeneration simply by managing grazing differently. And seeds will begin to germinate that were never present before. And you can also do pasture cropping. One of the things that Colin Size talked about in my interview with him that is about to go live soon is that when you plant annuals, in his case, he was planting cereals into pasture that had been grazed hard. They observed all kinds of the germination of all kinds of different grass species that had not been previously present, as well as other species in the furrow where they planted the cereals. But they had the synergistic effect of triggering the germination of dormant seeds. And so there are things that can be done in addition to the approach that you're thinking of. Have a cover crop of Japanese radish, buckwheat, oats, which has been attacked by rust. What nutritional foliar spray can I use? You need to use trace minerals, something like AEA's micropack and macropack combination. Question from Michelle. I have a big quantity of used fried oil. Is it a good idea to add it to wood chips, compost, or soil for increased humic substances? If I apply a big quantity of compost to plant over it, yeah, Michelle, so skimming through your question, trying to understand it well, yes, you can use oils. You can add oils to wood chips during the composting or mulching process. However, I would suggest exercising caution with the application rate. It depends, of course, on your setting, your context, how much wood chips you're applying, etc. But I have observed detrimental effects from applying oils directly to soil. When we apply them to chips, I've observed positive effects up to as much as 8 to 10 gallons per acre on a band of wood chips that was 6 feet wide and 4 inches deep on a row of tree fruit. Possibly we could have gone higher in that setting, in that context. So I would definitely combine it with wood chips or with mulch, not apply it straight to the soil. And I don't have extensive experience, so that's the best answer that I have for you at the moment. Question from Benina. Hi, Benina. Can you talk about pH in irrigation water and how that will affect nutrients and Brix levels? How much money should we spend on getting that level dialed in? Well, those are two very different questions. It is not so much the pH itself as it is the minerals that are contained within the water that are influencing the pH. So those elements which are particularly problematic are the carbonates and particularly the bicarbonates. So I would use a water analysis and actually measure the carbonates and bicarbonates, and then because they have a very detrimental effect on nutrient absorption as well as on soil biology. And once we know where those levels are, we can make more specific recommendations on whether it's worthwhile actually addressing them. Because as you point out, you can easily, once you start looking at sulfur burners or acid injection, you can rapidly spend a great deal of money. And in some cases, it is very, very worthwhile. In other cases, depending on the degree of severity of the problem, it's debatable. All right. We still have a few questions. I'm going to go ahead and answer a couple more, but the questions are continuing to trickle in. I promise to stay here all the way through, but sadly, I have some mental fatigue that might keep me from keeping all those promises. I've answered 130 questions at this point and keep blowing through them. So I'm going to stick around and answer a couple more, but we're probably going to have to wrap it up here in just a little bit. Question from Nicholas. What are the most important things to address in soil and plant health to avoid fungicides and small grains, especially wheat? Nicholas, the answer to this is actually quite easy. It is trace minerals. It's zinc, manganese, copper, boron, cobalt. I mean, you keep hearing that phrase come up, that sequence come up for disease resistance just over and over and over again. Those are the foundational pieces. And you can actually address these as a foliar. You can foliar feed these trace minerals and outperform a fungicide application even after you have the disease present. I've done it many, many times. Question from Curtis. I'd like to stop using 2800 and start using amino acids in winter wheat. Can you apply too much amino acids to get a vegetative response like nitrate? Curtis, I suppose anything is possible. And certainly, as I say, that you can't do that. Someone somewhere will succeed in doing that, but you would have to apply a tremendous quantity. I haven't observed putting on amino acids and getting an excess of vegetative response like you can get with nitrate. You can get a healthy vegetative response, absolutely, but we don't see the unhealthy degree of vegetative response from amino acids. I'm sure you could put on enough, and you could put on some specific amino acids to produce that outcome, but I wouldn't expect it to be very common. Question, are there differences between C-stem, C-shield, and C-crop? Yes, there definitely are. If there weren't, we wouldn't have 3 different products. Question from Mark Angelini. What strategies have you seen for remediating hardpan compaction without physical intervention? You're in red Virginia clay. So Mark, there's a researcher at the University of Kentucky. Last name is Murdock, M-U-R-D-O-C-K. I forget his first name. It's been probably 10 years since I looked at his research, but he was doing some fascinating research on the use of annual ryegrass to break up fragipan soils. And I think his research might be the perfect fit for what you were looking for. And in addition to annual ryegrass, I mean, you can use other forbs, tillage radishes and other forbs like chicory. These forb plants tend to have long taproot type structures, and those taproots are quite effective at moving through compaction layers and breaking them up permanently. So it depends on what your cropping system and context is and so forth, but I would consider doing more forbs, fewer grasses, and perhaps, depending on your context, looking at annual ryegrass specifically. I think I'm going to call it a wrap. There are a number of really good questions here that I haven't gotten to and that I haven't answered, and for that, I apologize. I will try to follow up with some of these on email, and if you didn't get your question answered, you're welcome to reach out to us directly. You can reach out to the AEA team or reach out to myself by email. You can find our contact information on the Advancing Eco Agriculture website. I want to say thank you all for being here and for staying with us. Like, we've had 100 people stay here for over 2 hours, which is remarkable. So thank you for being here, for all the great work that you do. I hope you find this information, continue to find it valuable and useful, and please continue to ask me great questions. I apologize I didn't get them all answered, but it is these types of questions that continue to stretch our boundaries and stretch our thinking and continue to get us all to improve. So thank you all for the work that you're doing, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Be well, everyone.